the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest downtown review of the political scene nationally and internationally. I'm afraid we're without Frank McKenna today. He's lost his voice, but as my good friend Jo Phillips, who's joining me on this podcast, says, he's not lost his opinions. So he'll be back with those next week, I'm sure. Today, we're going to discuss a range of issues at home, obviously dominated by the spring statement that Rachel Reeves is going to make. Joe's already said to me before we even came on air, it's going to be Rachel's tightrope, and we'll explore all of that. And in the second part of the podcast, we'll look abroad to the continuingly troubled scene in Russia, Gaza, and a new candidate for our concern, Turkey. So hello, Joe. How are you?
Good morning. Well, obviously we miss Frank, but it does allow us to talk about the things that we're interested in, like bright headlights and obscure films and football teams lower down the league than Everton. Yes,
well, of course, we've been in the strange situation of no football. I feel like a recovering drug addict. My whole structure of my weekend is destroyed by the absence of football. But let's get on to substantive issues. I mean, it really is going to be a challenging week for Rachel Reeves. I probably I was going too far last week where I suggested that her future could be on the line. But I do think this is going to be a defining speech that she's going to make. We already know of the unrest in the Labour Party over the benefit cuts. But if this week unprotected departments are going to suffer cuts, particularly, it's almost inconceivable that local government will suffer. But despite the huge majority, there is unrest within the party. On the other hand, the nation's finances are in great difficulty, and drastic action is required. And the nature of that action and who's going to suffer for it, and crucially, what effect it's going to have on business confidence, which is already fairly low, it's really going to be quite a defining week for Rachel from accounts.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Jim. I was listening to Peter Hain, now Lord Hain, on the radio yesterday, and he was being extremely diplomatic. But the point he made was that, Clement Attlee, widely regarded as the best prime minister this country's ever had, came into power after the Second World War with massive national debt because of the war, but managed to set up the NHS, build hundreds of thousands of council homes, set up free education, and transform the country. And I think the problem that Rachel Reeves has got, and we've spoken about this before, she's boxed herself in because she is a woman of the Treasury, and she's now caught that she doesn't want to be seen to be breaking her own fiscal rules. She's terrified of doing another Liz Truss, although I have to say I think Liz Truss was a one-off, and let's hope it stays like that. But there is a point when you have to be pragmatic and you have to go, actually, things have changed a lot. We've now had to bring forward our increased spending on defence, and she could do, as Frank suggested a couple of weeks ago, she could follow what European countries are doing and relax the rules to allow that spending on defence, that it doesn't come out of other budgets. I mean, the truth of it is, Jim, and as you rightly say, local government, notwithstanding some of the appalling management that they have presided over, and that's from Labour and Conservative and Lib Dem and coalition authorities, they are in a crisis, and that crisis is caused by and large by the statutory duty to fund and supply social care. So, what have we done about social care? Well, we've kicked it into the grass for yet another bloody review. But there's no more money coming for social care. The huge thing also is the lack of housing, which we know is a problem. So councils are spending an absolute fortune on temporary accommodation for homeless families. Plus, there's all the other things. And what you're seeing is, you know, cutting, paring into the bone now. The closure of libraries, art centres, theatres, playing fields, sports centres, services, you know, and it's all falling back again onto voluntary and charities and church groups and things like that, which is all fine and all great. And it's, you know, it's wonderful that communities come together, but they can't do it forever and ever. And of course, many of those organisations are also going to be hit by the increase in national insurance coming in next week and the minimum wage. So, you know, she's got herself into this pickle. And I think there are a lot of people within and without the Labour Party saying, for goodness sake, now is the time to say things have changed. Yes, it was only in July that they were elected to government, but things have changed significantly around the world for her to say, right, okay, forget what I said before, take the flak for doing a U-turn and start putting money into things to fix it.
Yes, I think that is a key point. You can call it cynical if you like, but it's not always that politicians are offered the opportunity of an excuse to make a dramatic change in their plans. And obviously the defence picture, the posture being adopted by Donald Trump, which makes it increasingly clear that he seems to believe in a sort of North American empire stretching from Mexico to Greenland, and doing a deal with Russia and letting Europe get on with its own affairs, has dramatically changed the picture, and therefore she could justify easing those restraints if she wanted to. And of course her example would be the Germans, who for decades have stuck to fiscal rules, which they've now busted spectacularly. I mean, one has to be conscious of, was it 100 billion we spend on interest, paying interest on our debt? So you know, this, we are storing up problems for future generations. But politically, the narrative, which has often been lacking in this government, as we've often said on this podcast, the narrative, look, I have to change because things have changed dramatically and Europe's being asked to do a lot more. And also domestically, they clearly looked at the civil service and found half of them not working in their offices and certainly not supporting the initiatives that the government want to pursue for these reasons, X, Y, and Z. But your instinct is that she won't go down that route and she'll be looking around for bits and pieces, as she's been doing since the budget in November.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, I don't know who, you know, I don't know how close she is to Keir Starmer. I don't know. I don't get her as a particularly political person. I get her as a very sensible, you know, in good times, she'd be a really good chancellor. And everything she said before the election sounded very plausible, but everything has changed. If you are not willing to change tack occasionally because the winds change, you are just either going to stay in the doldrums. I mean, sorry to use all these sailing analogies, or you're going to find yourself careering onto the rocks. I mean, I was listening to Heidi Alexander this morning, the Transport Secretary, talking about the fire at Heathrow, which we'll come on to in a minute. But, you know, I thought, actually, you know, she would make quite a good chancellor. You know, nobody is indispensable. And in politics, that is truer than any other profession, I think, as you and I both know, Jim.
Yes. I mean, obviously, the key to the government strategy is a slightly longer term one of growth.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
No, I mean, you know, and the growth is meant to take up the slack and make it not necessary to make cuts and so on. But that's, you know, A, it's a longer term thing, and B, there's evidence that some of the actions the government have taken have actually been against growth.
Well, exactly. And I think, you know, it's a little bit about sort of pump priming, or rolling the pitch, if you like. If you invest, you know, we've talked about this before. If you invest in housing, well, that's good because you're going to employ the bricklayers, the carpenters, the electricians, the architects, quantity surveyors, etc., which we don't have, obviously. But, you know, you begin to start building a successful sector of industry. Now, you know, if you wanted to do that quickly and smartly, what you could say is, right, we're going to bulldoze all the current planning things, but just to make it simpler, we're going to say 10% of new housing or new build, if you like, and no more than 10% on existing housing estates, towns, villages, what have you. Now that might mean 6 houses in a village. It might mean 100 houses somewhere else, but you wouldn't get the same backlash, and you wouldn't end up with great swathes of the countryside caught in the endless delay. There are lots and lots of things that the government could do to quick. And I should say, you know, that it is good that waiting lists are coming down for the 5th month in a row, bearing in mind we've just gone through the winter when we're, you know, only just coming out of it. So that is a significant improvement. Getting rid of NHS England, Public Health England, whatever it's called, that is a good thing. But there are too many things where they're trying to fix the problem and people are not feeling the benefit. And what people are seeing is a reluctance for employers to take on new staff. You're seeing shops closing in high streets, the little shops, you know, the cafes, the hairdressers, the hardware shops, the pubs, the bed and breakfasts, those sort of things that keep local economies going. They simply can't afford to take on the extra national insurance contribution and the minimum wage. So that doesn't help anybody. And I think, you know, people are fed up with the, oh, it was all the Tories' fault. Well, we know it was. 14 years and they absolutely spectacularly screwed everything and didn't invest in anything at all, you know, whether that's schools, prisons, the health service, roads or anything else. But you can't keep saying that to people when they actually think, I can't pay my bills. You know, council taxes just come through this month to lots of people, energy prices, food in the shops, all of those things. People need to feel and see a difference, and they're not. You know, we talked about Birmingham last week. Well, if you live in Birmingham, in those areas where you've got more rats than people, you're thinking, well, actually, who do I vote for and why do I bother?
Yes, just one slight pushback. I mean, on education, the Conservatives' record in improving school performance was a plus. It'll be interesting to see whether she refers to the black hole. There comes a time when what was a great headline in the autumn becomes stale and inappropriate. So it'll be interesting whether she relies on that, or, as we've already said, the change in the international perspective and the coming of Trump as being the reason for doing what she does. I mean, I suppose one thing, you talk about easing of the fiscal rules and things like that. I mean, she's got to bear in mind the confidence of the markets. So we can sit here and urge her to do this, that and the other. But do you think that in her mind is a sort of, not a fear of a trust style collapse in trust that we saw at the time of the brief prime ministership of Liz Truss? But do you think she's got to have one eye on that, and that might restrain her?
Yes, and I think that's, you know, when I say that I don't think that she's a particularly political animal, I think that is where her focus is much more on how the markets respond than how, you know, if you like, it's head and heart, and that is the head side. That's the hard facts of how the market. But as many very eminent and very well qualified economic and fiscal forecasters and analysts have said over the last week or so, you can't make a budget based on how you want the OBR and everybody else to respond in 5 years' time. The whole point is to trim your sails accordingly. Now, you know, we've suddenly had to find this extra money for defence, which we were going to do at some point. But, you know, the cut to international aid, we also know, it was revealed over the weekend that, you know, there is no end in sight to the huge cost of asylum seekers being put up in hotels and temporary accommodation. So those things can't change. So where do you cut those little bits? And the problem is that so much of it feels like a little bit here and a little bit there. There's a growing clamour for bigger wealth taxes, whether that's on individuals or companies. And I sort of think that where Rachel Reeves is right to be prudent, and she's right to be looking at the reaction of the markets, but the markets have not reacted well to her caution so far. You know, we know that.
Well, what about a wealth tax? I mean, that's what the left and the parliamentary party want. They want a wealth tax.
So why not? You know, why keep attacking? You know, even if it's only an extra £1 a week here or an extra tenner a week here, all of those things impact the people who Labour are supposed to protect.
Well, I'll just rehearse the argument. You'll drive the entrepreneurs out of the country.
Well, but you won't. actually. There are lots of people who are perfectly willing to pay more tax. And frankly,
Really, I haven't met them, but anyway, I'll take your word for it.
well, they say they will. And, we've had this whole question came up last week, actually, about the idea that Westminster Council want to do, which is if a house or property is sitting empty, that they use the powers that they've already got, all local authorities have got the power to basically take back empty property after 2 years. Westminster wants to bring it down to 6 months. Well, there's a whole load of arguments that we don't need to go into here about whether you can take somebody else's property and whether 6 months is too short a time. But there is no doubt that certainly in London and other big cities, there is an enormous amount of property that is owned by people who contribute and pay nothing into this country. There's also an awful lot of stuff that we could be doing with the seized Russian assets and the frozen Russian assets, and we could be using that to support effort in Ukraine. I mean, I think, I wouldn't want to be in Rachel Reeves' shoes, but she needs to show that she's listening. And the one thing that this government has failed to do since it got elected has listened, whether it's to, farmers or charities or employers or business groups. And this sort of like, no, I'm not listening. Look at the hand,
No, because they all want to make, this is Rachel Reeves now, I don't listen to them because they all want me to spend money that I haven't got.
Yeah, but there are some people where you have to say, okay, all right, maybe we've gone too far, or maybe we could do it a different way. What she doesn't seem to be willing to do is listen to people who are coming up with other alternatives. And I think that's, the thing about social care really bugs me, because, why do you kick that into the long grass when it is the biggest elephant in the room of every town hall in the country? Because that is the biggest cost. And there is no way out of it, because the government hasn't changed the rules to say, right, this now comes under the Department of Health. This is no longer a local government responsibility.
Right. Well, let's move on now to the Heathrow incident on Friday. Particularly damaging because one of the underlying currents at the moment is, and one of the reasons the Tories were kicked out, is the perception that nothing works in this country. And in a sense, that was put on display on stilts on Friday when Heathrow Airport was forced to close because of the failure of a substation. A lively argument has broken out. I see the National Grid have been pitching in over the weekend saying actually there wasn't a problem. There were 2 other substations that could have been brought online. I mean, this is a bit of a technical argument that I venture to suggest that neither you nor I have the expertise to know about. But the argument seems to be that one way or another, Heathrow should have been able quickly to switch over to alternative forms of supply, which would have kept the airport open. What's your general take on the Heathrow horror?
My first reaction was, oh, that'll be the Russians. And then my second thought was, hang on, if we get into that sort of attitude, every time you've got a sticky fridge door, you're going to think, oh, that's bloody Putin who's buggered up that kitchen drawer or the cabinet. But I think a lot of people would have thought that that was sabotage of some description. But we've now got, as you say, this rather unseemly spat between Heathrow Airport and National Grid, both of whom are private industries. And I think that is the answer to this. Where is the oversight of all of these things? Yes, there'll be a quick inquiry, and yes, there'll be a report, and yes, there will be things. I mean, to be fair, Jim, it is Europe's busiest airport, and it was back up and running within 24 hours, which I think is quite amazing. And I know that it was hugely inconvenient, but it does cast a whole shadow over, and back we go to Rachel Reeves. Have we got the infrastructure and the oversight to ensure a third runway? Because if you are reliant on private companies, private sector, we've seen what's happened in the water industry. So whether it's Heathrow Airport or and I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we nationalize Heathrow, but if you've got private companies, they will look to blame somebody else, and if that other somebody is another private company, we, the public, who are in the middle of all of this, whether we're passengers or people waiting for cargo to arrive, are caught in the middle. And I think, there are huge issues about our infrastructure, and, the word I keep coming back to is resilience. I mean, we're 5 years today since the first lockdown. have we become any more resilient than we were when COVID broke out? And I think the answer is no. And I think that's perhaps where Rachel Reeves and the government should have started from, back in July. Where are we? How much further forward have we moved? Because in the similar sort of way to keep blaming the Tories, we can't keep blaming COVID for everything else, whether that's, children not doing well at school, rise in mental health, lack of business confidence. There is a point where you have to move on. And I would say, we need to move on, but we need the government through the economy to start moving things on. And when you see things like that, it doesn't encourage international investors. I mean, many people said, oh, it's an embarrassment, and all the rest of it. It's made Britain a laughing stock. I mean, I think that's probably going a little bit too far. People were hugely delayed and inconvenienced, and a lot of money will have been lost. But there was no danger. Nobody was hurt. No planes crashed. And, if you look at it in that perspective, it was actually closed for, as I say, less than 24 hours.
One of the things you allude to the fact that it's a private company, and private companies always have to weigh up the investment they make in contingency planning. How likely is the risk? I mean, we often have this argument, we have it less now because of climate change, but how much should we invest? It actually does relate to airports. How much should we invest in snow clearing operations for events that very rarely happen? So private companies are always balancing, how much contingency should they invest in? I mean, imagine Heathrow could easily have another 2 or 3 substations around and pay for that. But then, of course, who's going to have to pay for that? The travelling public. And air passenger duty is already something that people complain about, the price of airline tickets. So private companies, there's always this question of how far should we go in contingency planning?
Yes, but then, one could argue that if you are going to hand over these huge things, and there must be a list of what is national infrastructure, which would include power, transport, and water. I mean, we saw last week that the High Court allowed Thames Water, that disgusting pool of fetid greed that has ripped off customers, lined the pockets of its shareholders, and pumped shit into the seas and rivers around this country, and nobody has been held accountable. So we see that's happened. There has to be a much faster, a much firmer, right, these are the things you must do, and after that, if you make profits, good luck to you, but you've got to do this. And if they don't want to do it, well, then we have to renationalize.
Yeah, I think it just widening it out a bit, it raises one's anxiety about our infrastructure in a wider sense. And I only say this because at the weekend near Bristol, a motorway bridge, concrete bridge, had to be demolished. The M4 was shut for 3 days over the weekend to allow that to be. And when you think about the amount of concrete infrastructure we've got in this country, many of it 30, 40, 50 years old, we had the rack controversy, but just our general concrete infrastructure. I mean, sooner or later, all our motorway infrastructure, hasn't it, and it's not going to last forever, has got to be. So there's a huge issue sort of looming there about our infrastructure, isn't there?
Yeah, and we've been talking about potholes this morning, or the government have, giving extra money to local authorities, but requiring them to produce reports and stuff. And the argument is it's all very well giving money, but then you've got to employ somebody to compile these blessed reports. What you actually need is people who are good at the job they're doing, which is for saying, why the hell are you digging this road up when you're going to be digging the end of it up in 2 weeks' time? Look at the schedules. If one person, I sat next to him once at a football dinner, one person can schedule the entire Premier League timetable and fixture list with a pencil and a ruler and work out, where there are train closures, where there are other games, where there's a, Lord Mayor's show or big pop concert, you would think, wouldn't you, that it's not beyond the wit of people to go, no, hang on a minute, we need one person in charge of this. These are the roads you do now, so you don't end up clogging up. But there's the point, Jim. 3 days closing to fix a motorway bridge, less than that to get Europe's busiest airport back up and running.
Yes. Okay. I think you're giving a slight pass to Heathrow.
No, I'm
on
not
this.
giving them a
I
pass,
mean,
but
there
I
were
do.
300,000 people around the world were
Yeah,
massively
yeah.
inconvenienced.
Yes,
You know,
of course they
funerals
were.
were missed, marriages were missed.
Yeah,
You know, well,
yeah, I know,
it's
but you
marriage
know,
ceremonies. I imagine a loving couple will still get married, but you know, anyway.
well, who knows? They might have changed their mind. I mean, you know, sitting in an airport lounge can put you off even your most beloved. No, but I mean, but the point is, had planes landed and had there been a terrible catastrophe, you know, we would be having a completely different conversation.
Right, let's move on to one more topic before we go to a brief break. The Netflix film Adolescence has received rave reviews. I mean, I've rarely seen the critics so united, and the subject
Have you seen
matter.
it now?
No, I haven't. I don't. I resisted going down this rabbit hole last week because nobody's interested in my personal financial circumstances, but I have an aversion to all this massive subscriptions for football and everything. You know, if I had a subscription for everything I'd want to watch occasionally, I'd be bust. And so I don't have subscriptions to things. And it's a massive frustration because, and this is another conversation we'll have another week, Netflix and the streamers are producing the stuff that the BBC and ITV used to produce,
Oh, yeah,
and the BBC can't afford to do it now. But let's not go there. So I haven't got Netflix.
So you haven't
So
got
I haven't
Netflix. Okay.
So,
all right.
but I've followed the discussion this week, not least the very statesmanlike speech by the former England manager Gareth Southgate on this subject. So let's talk about the issues that have been raised by that, which is the feeling that a lot of young men and boys have now of they're worried about their role in life, whether they're being judged, the influences are being brought to bear on them, and you know, some of the statistics that I've been looking at over the last week. I mean, as I understand it, only 50% of families in this country have a mum and dad. So 50% are single parents or other arrangements now. And you know, the lack of a father figure in the household, the pervasiveness of pornography, and the sort of the Tate influence on people, you know, very, very worrying indeed. You know, and the lack of motivation and things like that. Now, I'm very interested in what you've got to say about this, because quite rightly, I know that over the decades you will have been championing women. You know, because you know, 2 decades ago, there was a huge crisis in women's role. You know, that we needed more women in Parliament, in the boardroom, that women needed to assert themselves in sport and all that sort of thing. And you know, to some extent, although there are problems, particularly associated with this search for masculine behaviour, which is causing new challenges to women. I fully take that on board. But you know, I mean, and I'm generalising now, but the one senses that young women have a better sense of their place, generally speaking, in society. Have we, in doing that, taken our eye off the ball as far as young men are concerned?
Jim, is this your way of saying, you know, you're not a follower of Andrew Tate, but the argument that, oh, equality for women has gone too far? No, it bloody hasn't.
No, I'm not saying.
No, I mean, I think, to go back to the initial point, Gareth Southgate, who is articulate, thoughtful, humble, and inspirational. His Dimbleby lecture, I would urge everybody to watch it, and it is available on the BBC. It's wonderful, but what his whole point was, again, it's this word about resilience and about learning to play as a team, and about the importance of having people around you who are mentors and supporters. And it doesn't have to be a dad at home. It can be a teacher. It can be a sports coach. It can be somebody you work with. It can be friends. But the point that he was making was that we judge success so much now by the amount of money you earn and the stuff you can buy with it and the power that you have over other people. That's where it gets, and this is a very sort of shorthanding, that's where it gets so dangerous, because if young men think that power is more important and that's their only way to success, well, who do you get power over easily? Young women. I mean, I think there are a whole load of issues around, women, girls and boys, and how they, you see girls going to school with so much makeup on it. It's absolutely ridiculous. And in fact, there's a school here where there's a huge controversy because the head teacher has decided that they will all, boys and girls, will wear trousers, because there have been so many complaints from shopkeepers and members of the public about the short skirts that the girls are wearing, where you can actually see their knickers. And you sort of think, well, when I was at school, which was about 400 years ago, none of that would have happened, because you'd have somebody who would make you kneel on the gym school floor, and they would measure the distance between the bottom of your skirt and your calf. And if it went shorter, you got a detention. But I think there is a really serious issue.
Can I just pause? That's an interesting point, because there's two ways of looking at that. And you've outlined one. Another is that it's exactly girls have the right to dress as they want and not be the subject of predatory behaviour. Yeah. That's an assertion of girls' and women's rights.
Yes, of course it is. But there is also the point that, appropriateness. Would you go into, I don't know, you wouldn't go into a church, let's say, wearing a bikini. And it's about that sort of thing about it, it's that old-fashioned word of decorum. What do you turn up for work in? Something that's appropriate. What do you turn up to school in? Something that's appropriate. And what you wear, and there's, we all have to abide by certain sort of mores, if you like, that what you wear in your private life is separate to what you wear in your public life. And when you're at school, that is part of your public life. So I think there are a whole load of issues about sexuality, about the malign influence of social media. But I think that the point that Gareth Southgate made so very, very eloquently was, it is beholden on all of us to try and be more supportive. And in a way, because it's the 5th anniversary of the lockdown, we did, many parts of the country, many small towns, villages and cities, there were pockets of community support that seem to have just evaporated. And we need to do that. But again, it goes back to, if you cut youth clubs, you cut libraries, you cut sports facilities, you cut the extracurricular activities in schools, you cut the music, the theatre, all the things, the other stuff, you're left with something that's pretty hollow. And people will fill that hollow space who aren't
the people who are filling the hollow space is the mobile phone. I mean, it was even said in part of the debate that the mobile phone, for a lot of young men, for instance, has replaced their father. They're getting all their information from mobile phones, and aspects of technology, the language, the culture, parents don't even begin to understand. And the challenge for parents, and it was a very interesting discussion, this, that parents have just got to try and get alongside and understand their sons, and particularly talking about sons here, and try and communicate with them.
Well, as a point for us to go into the next break on, because even if Frank is languishing on his sick bed with man flu, he'll go, oh, those old codgers are going on about something again. But I would say a lot of it comes down to, if you sit at a table and you all eat together, instead of somebody going off with their microwave meal up to their bedroom to play on their computer or allegedly doing their homework, actually those joint things where you all sit down, even if it's just once a week for Sunday lunch or Wednesday supper or whatever it is, those are the points when you have conversations. And I think it's about being present. Families are not a group of people who happen to live in the same house. They should be, whatever the makeup of that family, they should be a group of people who support each other and help each other. And I think that's the point that Gareth Southgate was making. And that family extends outside of the home to schools, youth clubs, sport and other organisations.
Thanks, Jo. We'll take a break now and then come back with a fairly light agenda: Ukraine, Turkey, Gaza and the Canadian snap election. Welcome back to the latest Downtown podcast. We're lacking Frank McKenna, who has a sore throat and not man flu, as was disgracefully suggested by my colleague Jo Phillips, former aide to Paddy Ashdown, who's joining me today. In the first part of the programme, we looked at domestic issues, and now we're going to turn to the foreign scene. attempts in the Ukraine situation, a much narrower ambition. Gone are Donald Trump's vainglorious claims that he would settle the Ukraine war in a day. We're now down to whether the two sides can agree not to bomb each other's energy infrastructure. Either the Americans are narrowing their ambitions, or there's a more sinister explanation for the way things are going there, Jo.
Yes, well, Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy, whose entire experience seems to be based on playing golf with Trump and having let him use his private plane because he was worried about assassination attempts, went out to Moscow. It was wonderful. Came back having criticised Keir Starmer for wanting to be like Winston Churchill for posing and posturing. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth, actually. Couldn't name 3 regions of Ukraine that he thought Putin that Ukraine could relinquish to Russia, and talked glowingly about a portrait that Putin had commissioned of Trump and how Putin had prayed for Trump during that alleged assassination attempt. I mean, with people like that, there is no hope because they are just playing Putin's game. And Trump is too vain to see that, and he will be flattered, and he's sending idiots halfway around the world to come back with more flattery. Meanwhile, the poor people of Ukraine are struggling on. I think things are getting very dangerous. There was a very good article in one of the Sunday papers by a former head of the armed forces who talked about, Trump basically being Putin's puppet, and reminding them, although the Americans seem to have a very slim grasp of geography and history, that this appeasement that they want to broker is not that different to what we in Britain and the French did in 1938. And we know what happened after that.
Yeah, I just can't get my head around that Trump doesn't seem to have a back wall against which he won't be pushed beyond. Because, normally speaking, when he wants something and somebody pushes back against him, which is what Putin's clearly done, he normally lashes out and tries to do something about it. But with this, where he actually said about 10 days ago, right, I've got Ukraine on side after that dreadful business in the White House office where they were shouting at each other. I've got Zelensky on board. Now it's up to Russia. There was a clear implication there that he expected Russia to respond. And if Russia's making a fool of him, I mean, what is going on here? Because Trump's behaving in a non-Trumpian fashion in this particular regard.
Well, and I'm afraid that just it just plays into the conspiracy theories or the truth, depending on your point of view. Is Trump a Russian asset, and has he been for a long time? Is it because he's been supported in the background, if you like, to carry out some of his more nefarious business operations in America with the support of Russian money, with the support of the Russian mafia? Have he and Putin got some deal to divvy up, the mineral wealth that is there in Ukraine? And what happens if Greenland and everywhere else? I mean, you're absolutely right, Jim. At what point does Trump, if he's supposed to be this great deal breaker, go, no thanks, I'm walking away? Because he appears to be quite willing to be pushed further and further into a corner. And meanwhile, I mean, Putin has got nothing to lose. He can carry this game on for months.
Apparently, there's quite a lot of pressure from American business to get doing deals with Russia again. A lot of frustration. Yeah. Apparently, airlines waiting to fly into Moscow, and and given that Trump does seem to see everything through a business eye. But I still think it's inconceivable that a focus just on what a shame it is that we can't be doing normal business with Russia and how that would increase America's wealth, and it completely ignoring the international implications of it, because there are, in my opinion, growing international implications. I mean, we after the Second World War, we put into place structures to prevent what had happened twice in the first half of the 20th century. And it does seem now as if, and we'll come on to discuss Turkey in a minute, that in a number of fronts, it's now every nation for themselves. And as you say, we all know how that story ended.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that Trump and the people around him have no sense of history. They are so isolationist, and it is America first, and it's all about business. And they're not sophisticated or informed enough to look at the implications. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, how many of us knew up until that moment how incredibly important Ukraine was to supply us with sunflower oil and things for fertilizers and flour and all of those things that we just take for granted? And I think, Trump sits there and he looks at a map of America, which in his world would include Canada and Greenland and probably Buckingham Palace as well, without stopping to think, what is the impact? But we've seen this, Jim, with the tariffs. He's had to row back on some of them because industries like the American car manufacturers have gone, hang on a minute, if you do this is going to put the price up and it's going to hit American citizens. The problem is, when you've got a country as vast as America that is so inward looking by and large, Europe seems a very long way away. And the other thing, and it was an interesting column that Alistair Campbell wrote in the very excellent New European a couple of weeks ago, while we're all looking at Trump and Putin, nobody's talking about China. And, there are all these other things going on around the world, as we will see when we get on to Turkey in a moment. And, meanwhile, we've got 50,000 Palestinians now, we know, killed in the war in Gaza. How have we allowed that to happen? Well, the answer is America has given the green light to Netanyahu. And, Biden was not much better, actually. But with Trump in power, he's absolutely not only got a green light, he's got a green light, and here's the accelerator pedal. So, if that's Trump's way of doing business, he will do a deal that is best for him. It's not even for America. It's best for him. And then he will walk away and leave other people to pick up.
Let's finish off on the Gaza thing, because we're limited for time, and there are two new issues that I want to raise. But on the Gaza issue, what one has to say, although the terms of the peace agreement have been breached, Hamas's refusal to release the remaining hostages, they've got to accept some responsibility for this and the misery that they're inflicting on their people, because that is the other way of looking at it. I mean, obviously, as we've agreed, Israel's response to all these things is always out of proportion and dreadful. But nevertheless, Hamas do have responsibility for this, not releasing the remaining hostages and trying to find a way through it.
No, absolutely. There is fault on both sides, but it did seem a little bit hopeful a few weeks ago that there was a willingness, but it was Israel that broke the deal first.
Well, let's going back to Ukraine and so on, cross the Black Sea, and let's remember Turkey's not far away, and indeed Turkey's strategic position is going to come into the discussion we're now going to have. But for anybody who's not been following it, President Erdogan effectively locked up the mayor of Istanbul, who was going to be his main challenger in the forthcoming elections. And there have been huge, widespread protests, not just widespread protests, but a sort of mock election, I think yesterday, where people voted to express their outrage that this sort of attempt to stop democracy was being undertaken. Now, as we discuss this, Joe, there's always this issue with Turkey that it's in NATO and, is a sort of allied to us, and therefore should we give them lots of slack in terms of how they operate democracy. But there's been growing concern over the years that Erdogan has presided over a country and in making it increasingly a sort of theocracy where there's a huge support for it being a secular state. There's been all these sort of tensions which seem to be blowing up now, and obviously Erdogan's expectation is that eventually, as in what's it called, Russia, Belarus, eventually people just lose momentum, lose hope, and it goes away and things proceed. How do you think it's going to go?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Turkey is so important strategically, geographically, and culturally, because it straddles, the Middle East and Europe. So it is immensely important, and it has been a very good ally over the years. It's also been immensely significant in dealing with Syria, with dealing with Iran, with dealing with refugees. But Erdogan has been there for 22 years. I mean, lots of people will go to Turkey on holiday. I was in Istanbul only a year ago, and it is a wonderful country, and you feel perfectly okay there. So this chap, who is the mayor of Istanbul, was about to be, and has in fact this morning been selected by his opposition party as the presidential candidate to stand against Erdogan. Now, the elections aren't imminent. I think they're 2028 actually, but they're certainly not a snap election like Canada's going to have next month. And he's been locked up on corruption charges. Now, what is it with these dreadful men like Erdogan that they won't say, okay, yeah, fine, stand against me, let's see what happens? And what you've seen is this extraordinary, spontaneous protest on the streets of Istanbul and other cities in Turkey. And they're not necessarily fighting against Erdogan or indeed for his opponent. They're fighting for democracy. And I think, Jim, that, we spend a lot of time on this podcast and in the other things that we all do, talking about how rubbish politicians are and how they fail and all the rest of it and how people give up. When you see people and you will have heard them on the news clips, I am here. This is about the street against the state, and you can replicate that around the world with varying degrees of success. As you mentioned, Belarus, but you've got it happening in Serbia as well at the moment. And I think, this is, again, it's close to home. Is Erdogan going to have a real crackdown? I mean, they've cut down, they've banned quite a lot of media activity, they've banned street protests. Well, that's going to have an impact. And then, as you rightly say, where do we sit as a partner? How much do we criticise Erdogan, and where do we push him towards if he wants support in having a hard line and crackdown on anyone who dares to oppose him?
Yeah, of course, he also cooperated in taking quite a lot of asylum seekers who were on the way to the UK. I can't avoid mentioning the fact, of course, in 2016, during the Brexit referendum, we were told that there were 80 million Turks, was it, who were waiting to come to this country as Turkey entered the European Union.
Yeah, strange, wasn't it, really? It didn't come out. But hey-ho, it's full of lies, isn't it? As we know.
And let's finally turn to Canada, where the newly installed Mark Carney has called a snap election for the end of April. One could say, is it foolish opportunism, and could he come unstuck? Because I would have thought that the interpretation of this is that the Liberal Party in Canada, which he's head, was in deep trouble prior to the orange man from the south of the border saying it should become the 51st state, and calling the previous Prime Minister Governor Trudeau and all that sort of stuff. And obviously their opinion poll ratings have improved. The Canadians are outraged by the behaviour of the United States, one of their closest allies and an intimate trading partner. And that this will therefore make them rally around Mark Carney, who's been quite outspoken about President Trump, and made it quite clear that if they're going to get into the tariff game, that Canada will and is responding. But, the question will be, will the Canadians think he's being a little bit too clever by half, and whatever was making the Liberals unpopular for internal Canadian reasons, which I'm afraid I don't know what the reason for Trudeau's unpopularity was, could it backfire on him? I'll just raise it with you.
Well, it might do. I mean, the problem for Mark Carney is that he's not a politician. He doesn't have a political parliamentary seat. So in a way, what he's doing is seeking a mandate as leader of his party. So presumably he will therefore stand in a seat, and then he will become a member of parliament, and then he will be the leader of the Liberals in Canada. I think, and this is only, looking from a long distance away, but I think people are quite willing to put other things on the back burner when their threat to their very existence is paramount. And the tariffs, of course, are huge. And Carney, who was, always very mild-mannered but very charismatic for a Bank of England governor and all the rest of it. But he has been quite fierce in saying, we will fight this, and we will fight this all the way. I was at a concert locally last night, and there were a Canadian band playing, and when they came on, they said, "We're Canadian, not American." I mean, the roar of applause in a tiny little hall in Whitstable, it is quite extraordinary. And I think, there is a groundswell of support around the world, which is, broadly speaking, Europe, Canada, the Commonwealth, if you like, with a small c, against America and against Russia. And
Canada and the United States wants to join the Commonwealth, according to
Donald
Trump.
And I think that's quite funny. You can be an associate member. I mean, isn't that the most absolutely sublime example of English understatement? That, would you like to, instead of trying to take my head as king of Canada and depose me, how about if you come to one of our garden parties as an associate member? I mean, it's just wonderful, and it shows you how absolutely stupid Trump is and how easy it is for Putin to play him.
Now, if of course Mark Carney's gamble, if I can put it like that, comes off, of course he will have a strengthened mandate from the Canadian people to confront the United States. And I just think Donald Trump should pause to reflect, because we've all got opinions about a large number of countries around the world. And I would suggest that Canada is right up there in most people's admiration. I mean, the Canadians who fought for us in the Second World War, the decency of the country, its liberal values, and everything we love about Canada, the Mounties and maple syrup, all those sort of cliches. But nevertheless, and the response of your audience last night is indicative that Trump has taken on the wrong country in this sort of struggle for North American hegemony.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he hasn't got anyone around him that is saying exactly that, which is saying, hang on a minute, this could play really badly. And I do think, what you've seen, and the good bit of Trump's taking up residence in the White House, if you like, is a much more united Europe, a stronger, much more present Canada on the world stage, a boost for Keir Starmer, and a little bit of common sense breaking out about where do we need to be and how do we need to plan for the next 5 or 10 years.
Yes. Just a final point, and then we must go. On that sort of solidarity, and Canada plays its role in this, have you been slightly apprehensive in the last week about the resilience of the coalition of the willing that Sir Keir Starmer is trying to build? There seems to be, this 100,000 troops available for Ukraine seems to be being scaled back and trying to bring people on board. Do you think?
I think, there's been a bit of a hit back, and the Daily Telegraph this morning has found some sniping generals to go, well, it's absolutely bloody ridiculous, stupid idea, that sort of thing. Of course, there was never going to be 100,000 troops on the ground immediately. But the point was to send a very clear message. And I think that is exactly what Keir Starmer did. And of course, you've got to work out, what are the terms of engagement? Are they there as peacekeepers, in which case, why not use the UN? Are they there, as monitors, if you like, observers? Are they there to offer logistics in things like cybersecurity, for instance, instead of armaments. There's a whole load of stuff, and there will be countries in that coalition of the willing who will have differing views. I mean, Italy is sort of rowed back slightly, but there is no doubt that we are facing war in Europe. There is an irony, Jim. In May, we celebrate the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Who would have thought that 80 years on, we are looking at the potential rerun of those awful times that led to that?
Well, on that rather grim thought, we'll bring this podcast to a conclusion. We all hope that Frank will be back with his clear throat and his opinions next week, but it only remains for me to thank you, Joe, and our producer, Chris Wilcox, and we hope you'll join us for another Downtown podcast next week.